So I wanted to make this video going over some of the interesting events that we are seeing at the moment when it comes to cryptocurrency and the way that money is exchanged. One of the biggest events of the year in 2020 that really didn't get very much media attention unless you're into cryptocurrency and financial news is actually that in the United States we had our first financial institution, a bank called Kraken Financial, which is actually approved to be regulated fully as a bank in the United States. And it is a cryptocurrency bank. So it's our first regulated cryptocurrency bank in the United States. It's based in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And Wyoming was the state that went ahead and made it possible for this bank to become legal and regulated. It's fully regulated. And there's a lot of implications that will be taken, I personally feel, from this event. So I found the moment of the first announcement of the Kraken financial approval. And this is the chart for that. So one of the things that I really feel is important to look at when we're observing anything that comes to mundane astrology and financial astrology is the chart for a specific moment in time where something changes. It's really hard to pinpoint the exact moment that a chart should be drawn, for example, for a corporation, because there's often many different points of change in the beginning processes of a corporation, or when a corporation goes public, for example, their IPO. But after doing some research on the timelines, I do think that this chart is a good one to start with, because this is really the first announcement of any regulatory authority essentially giving permission within the United States for a cryptocurrency bank to basically exist and be regulated. So this is a big deal, and there are a lot of really interesting things about this chart. So just to go over some of the initial elements that we're going to point out. The chart is a Libra rising, and Mercury and the part of fortune are at 12 and 16 degrees of Libra. And you can see how, this is an interesting chart, because the 12th house represents things that are hidden. It represents things that have been relegated to the shadows of life. And to see Mercury there with the part of fortune, Mercury is the traditional planet that has signification over trades and transfers, also merchant work. Banking is typically associated with Saturn, which is like more big banks, but Mercury is more the mercurial element of trading. It's the day-to-day aspect of prices going up and down. It's the fluctuations of market trends. And it's about like the commonplace ways that money changes hands. So I just think it's really interesting that Mercury in this chart is conjunct the part of fortune, which is, where money comes through traditionally in charts. And so you have Mercury there with the part of fortune in the 12th house. So this wasn't big news at the time, but this does potentially have big impacts on the culture overarchingly over time. And so you still see this kind of Mercury part of fortune happening in the shadows. However, they are in aspect to Jupiter, which is over in Capricorn. So Mercury is in a square with Jupiter in the third house. So Mercury squared Jupiter, it is almost kind of like the little guy squaring off with the big guy. It's kind of the Kraken Financial Institution may have some tricks up its sleeve, and the whole process of embracing cryptocurrency into the marketplace on a wider scale with the advancement of regulatory authorities and regulatory bodies being open to this idea is going to threaten the status quo, which is Jupiter in Capricorn down here. And the reason that I also say that is because Jupiter also has natural signification for just like overarching leaders, experienced like well-established patterns within society. So the Mercury square Jupiter, I do think, is prominent in this chart. We also have a new moon forming in the 11th house, and the sun is actually in trine to Saturn. So again, and it's also the moon is in trine to Jupiter, applying to a trine of Jupiter. So even though we do see the potential with for conflict between the mercurial aspects of this change that is going on in the country, again, a little bit behind the scenes, a little bit quieter. It wasn't necessarily huge news at the time. We do start to see the with the positive aspects with the sun and the moon trining these big heavy hitting power players down at the root of the chart, which are in Capricorn. It does show that there is an opening up and there's an illumination happening in regards to the foundations of society. There is a pathway that is opening up here, even though it's kind of quiet at the moment because this is happening in the 12th house. Overall, this does feel to me like this is a chart that represents something that is brewing under the surface, which has the potential to change the future. If we start to compare the US natal chart, which I personally use the Sibley chart, I think this one is the most accurate by far because of different elements that I've seen with regards to transits happening in the United States during huge events. This chart works really well with transits for the United States. So if we take the United States natal chart and we apply the Kraken Financial approval chart around on the outer ring to look at the transits here, we start to see some really interesting themes developing. So guess who also has a natal Mercury and part of fortune conjunction? The United States of America. And this conjunction is actually in the 8th house, which is traditionally associated with debts and taxes, and also with the resources of partners or enemies. Having the Mercury and part of fortune in the natal chart of the US in conjunction, it's really fascinating. You can actually see that this conjunction is sort of mirrored in this conjunction here in the Kraken Financial chart. You also start to see that the Mercury and part of fortune conjunction, right, which is that fortunate movement towards a new way of transferring wealth and exchanging money, these are conjunct the USA's natal Saturn, which in this chart very strongly points to the establishment, the order, it's the leadership and this sort of the structure of society in the US birth chart. That's what Saturn represents. So seeing Mercury and part of fortune conjunct this very, very hyper strong Saturn in exaltation in the USA natal chart, to me shows that this is actually a change that while it's quiet at the moment of, at the moment that this happened in September of 2020, it's actually in a very prominent position. It's in the 10th house of the USA birth chart, and it's conjunct a very important planet in the USA birth chart. So this is actually, I feel, going to become a very fortunate thing for the United States. I don't think that this is the last financial institution by any means to get cryptocurrency approval to function as a crypto bank. And I believe that this is the beginning of a new system of banking in the United States, because if you actually look at the natal Saturn of the United States, the natal Saturn is the second house ruler. And the second house rules the treasury, but it also rules banking institutions as well and finance. So when you have the ruler of finances in the 10th house of the natal chart of a country, it shows that the banking institutions have a very strong presence in that country, especially when the ruler of the second house is so hyper dignified as Saturn is in his position at that degree of Libra in his sign of exaltation. So when we look at these aspects, one of the elements that I really feel is forming is the potential that this is going to, number one, improve the financial situation in the United States over time. Again, this is a slower process, but this will over time improve the financial situation of the United States. I feel that this will over time give it will challenge, here's the thing, it will challenge the powers that be, though, in the United States. It will probably begin to challenge the authority of the most powerful banks, the central banks, in part because the cryptocurrency bank, Kraken Financial, is actually functioning with 100% liquidity, in the sense that every unit of currency that anyone has stored at Kraken Financial is there. It's on their books. Everything, every note of currency, whatever type of currency it is that anyone has deposited there, they have in their possession. Even if they were at some point, even if there was a bank run, for example, and every client of theirs who had an account went there and wanted to pull their cryptocurrency out, they would be able to give back all of that money. There is something interesting that I feel is going on here, where we are seeing something that is actually fortuitous to our financial system. And it will improve things over time by making them more transparent. Because you also see here the midheaven, which is the point of destiny in a chart, right? It's the direction things are headed. The midheaven in the Kraken Financial chart is actually conjunct the United States natal Mercury part of fortune conjunction. And that's again in the 8th house. So we could see this event, which was, not very widely publicized, on September 16th of 2020. This event could potentially change the way that the United States deals with its debts and the way that the United States fulfills its obligations to its own people and to its foreign relations as well. So there's a lot going on in this chart that we could look at in this transits wheel. But one of the things as well that I want to point out is that the sun in the transit chart is conjunct the natal Neptune of the United States. And the natal Neptune of the United States, I could make an entire separate video on this, but the natal Neptune of the United States is in square to the natal Mars in the United States. And when you have a Mars square Neptune in a natal chart, for example, if it's an individual's chart, this is a really difficult aspect. This is an aspect that is associated with abuse. And so in the chart of a country, we could say that the United States has been one of the most powerful countries in the world, but internally, the United States has an incredible amount of abuse of power and manipulation. Because that's, what we would look at if this was an individual's chart. Having Mars square Neptune is a very difficult aspect. It's often associated with having abusive parents or having an abusive psychological relationship in early years, or even an abusive physical relationship. This can also have to do with power plays, and where people feel manipulated by someone who uses their own fears or their own desires against them and makes them alternatingly feel shame or to feel powerless. So we see this aspect in the natal chart of the United States, and it's actually being highlighted by the sun, because the sun here in at 24 Virgo, it's both conjunct the natal Neptune and it's also squaring the natal Mars. So it's highlighting this abuse of power in the United States that has existed for, basically the majority of the existence of the United States. And a lot of that abuse of power has developed over time in the United States as a result of the actions of large scale institutions such as the financial institutions. And I won't go into any more detail than that in this video because we could talk for hours, but essentially what I feel with the sun highlighting that aspect in this chart is that this is potentially going to bring some things to light over time. Again, I'm not saying that it's bringing things to light right away because this is a mundane chart and there are many more aspects that are forthcoming that are going to help bring about these changes. But I really do feel like the sun in square to Mars and conjunct the natal Neptune of the United States is highlighting that element of the abuse of power that has been persistent in the United States. And this is going to come through innovation. The clarity and the awareness and the transparency that is able to be arrived at through the use of cryptocurrency banks, which are held to different standards, much more stringent standards. And remember, this is cryptocurrency. This is currency that is able to be independently owned and independently controlled, unlike US currency. There are a lot of different ways that currencies are being debased by governments and central banks. Essentially, they're printing money right now in many countries, and this is debasing the value of currency, but that's not happening with crypto. So that's another angle of how this movement towards acceptance of cryptocurrency and regulation, stringent rules and regulation for cryptocurrency banks in the United States could begin the process of, number one, giving people a more ready access to independently control the value of their money and also the money itself. But secondly, it also in that process is going to reveal all to like the common people, to people who are not researching things like this all the time and not aware of some of these shadowy laws that we have around banking that protects large scale institutions at the expense of the value that is held by the common people. It's going to expose a lot of that. It's going to expose a lot of the darkness because the new trend towards this currency is potentially, again, this is all potential, but if this continues, I see astrological signatures here that point to the capacity for this new, more transparent, more clear direction that money could be going in that is really going to reveal some of the darkness and some of the power plays and the abuse of power and the manipulation of financial markets that Americans and people all over the world have been subject to. There are traditional economic theories that have to do with technologies and the implementation of new technologies, which often follow predictable patterns. And one of these is the S-curve. The S-curve is something that has been noted over and over again throughout the existence of new technologies. And as human beings have created new technologies, we've of course been tracking the usage as they expand within society. And one of the really fascinating things about the S-curve phenomenon is actually that essentially it takes the same amount of time for one new technology to reach, like from the time that it's created to reach about a 10% overall market usage. That's the same amount of time that it takes that technology to reach 90% market penetration. So I'll say that again with an example. Essentially, in 1994, cell phones were being used by roughly 10% of the population. But they were originally created and introduced to the market 14 years earlier in 1980. And then following 1994, where only 10% of people used cell phones, 14 years after that, in 2009, 90% of people were using cell phones in the United States. So this is just a really good way of describing and looking at the time that it takes for a new technology to be created and then to actually be implemented into society. So for cell phones, for example, 10% of people, after 14 years after cell phones were created, 10% of people roughly were using them in the United States. Another 14 years passed by and 90% of people were using cell phones in the United States. Cryptocurrency itself came out in 2009, and a study in 2019 came forward showing that 10% of people in 2019 in the United States held some form of cryptocurrency already. So if we go by the S-curve logic, if things continue to move along the path that we see in so many other, like the pattern that's replicated across so many other technologies, it's very possible that by 2030, there could be 90% of people in the United States holding some form of cryptocurrency. Some of the key dates that could be really influential over the next 10 years that may significantly advance cryptocurrency's movement forward, at least in the United States, which is probably going to be reflected alongside many other countries in the world, are the dates of the outer planet ingresses. Outer planets changing signs represent large-scale shifts that affect everything from industry changes and to overall major shifts in supply chains as well as consumer behavior. They can also represent big shakeups in institutions. So for example, when Pluto entered Capricorn, that was in 2008, and that was when we had the 2008 banking crisis. And Capricorn is the sign of the big banks. So Pluto entering the sign of the big banks represented the onset of what was going to be and what continues to be a movement through the sign of Capricorn that is characterized by very dramatic shifts and destabilization to our largest institutions that we have on the planet. Pluto's Aquarius ingress is the next upcoming huge shift as far as the far outer planets. Technically, Saturn will move into Pisces before that happens, but Saturn and Jupiter don't take as long to move through the sign. So while they do signify changes, those changes are less far-reaching than when we have the far outers, which are Pluto, Neptune, and Uranus changing signs. And when you have the three outer planets all changing signs within a couple of years period, which I'm going to show you, that's what we have coming up, you can expect major restructuring in society. So 2023, we could start to see a big shift when it comes to everything that is ruled by Aquarius, which is technology in a large sense. The sign of Aquarius, we obviously don't have a lot of ways of looking to traditional texts to find associations for elements of technologies that didn't exist back then, but Aquarius has become associated with technologies. It's become associated with the internet, and it's become as well associated with the everyday individuals that make up the collective. Aquarius is not about the elites. It's about grassroots efforts. It's about the common people. And it's about systems that are divided enough to allow for fair play. Everything about the air signs, they all encompass this idea of fairness and this concept of justice and just systems. Anything less than that are not going to be seen through the eyes of Aquarius as perfect. Perfection to the sign of Aquarius is really about a clean, equal slate. It's about things, it's about markets having a financial, level playing field, for example. So having Pluto entering into that sign could, and as it's leaving Capricorn, where it's been shaking up our power structures on the planet, our most powerful structures have been threatened during Pluto's movement through Capricorn. As Pluto ingresses into Aquarius, it's going to bring that energy of transformation to the everyday people. It's going to bring that stirring up of that desire for fairness when it comes to technology. And Pluto tends to go right to the depths of things. Pluto doesn't care about, the swamp. Pluto will go down into the darkest, murkiest, messiest things in order to find the truth and bring it up. So one of the things that could happen as we see Pluto moving into Aquarius is we could see real shifts being made when it comes to technologies, and where technologies have infringed on the rights of everyday people, that could be exposed on a major, major level. And there are historical precedents for that kind of energy with being associated with important alignments in the sign of Aquarius. So we could see reveals in terms of the way that technology has been used to influence or to harm or to remove rights from everyday people. And we could see how the technology that's used to house, implement, store, or transfer wealth have, been the technology that underpins those systems could be in question around this time of 2023. So we could see some major developments when it comes to the technological ways that money is stored, because Pluto also deals with wealth. And so Pluto leaving the sign of Capricorn and moving into Aquarius could be a signification that some form of wealth transfer or a redirection of wealth could be underway. But ideally and hopefully, with any luck, this is happening by some element of either big tech or the technology that underpins the banking and financial industries being called into question, or going through a major transformation to with the goal in mind to make it more fair.